Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I am still running this series on government engineering, I suppose. Political engineering is what I call it. Hopefully, that's descriptively accurate. Um, but in any case, I have been somewhat interested in design optimization with regard to government, and especially uh, with regard to voting procedures. Specifically, in this video, I'm going to be talking about optimization with regard to voting procedures, and if we could sort of tweak our voting procedures to make the government and the legislation and law the government and the law that it produces, the government and the policy that it produces, more democratic. I think that that's ultimately a good thing. The reason that the founders regarded democracy as a good thing, and the reason why I regard democracy as a good thing, is because it is fundamentally it's a deliberative process. Ideally, democracy is a deliberative process of government and of policymaking and of lawmaking. And that's primarily why we departed from autocracy, from monarchy, um, from autocratic republics, if there is such a thing, from constitutional autocratic monarchical republics. We departed from these systems fundamentally because, or at least our country departed from these previously existing European systems because we felt that it would be that there were systems that were more advantageous to human interests. And I think that ultimately we 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 if conservatives are very wedded to preservation, and progressives are so conservatives are about preservation and progressives are about progress. And I think that as we if I consider myself a progressive, that I am a progressive. I'm not certain. I'm willing to turn the tables, but not flip them over. You know, and so even as I would identify as a progressive in some of the design optimizations that I propose and the procedural optimizations that I propose, I'm fundamentally a uh, a progressive that at least acknowledges the value of certain traditional procedures that we have. Certainly, they exist for a reason. And there was a logic that dictated the creation of those procedures and those systems. And so let's just put it that way. But let's move on, right? And right. So, in the way of a proper progressive, I'm going to move on. So, what is what do I mean in the title of this video? What do I mean? Right, this whole idea of what about supermajority rule, right? Because we have this concept of majority rule in this country, and logically and mathematically, we have to rely upon some sort of um, measurement of votes that calculates that discerns whether it's an election or an act of voting upon legislation, whether it's the people voting in an election or representatives voting on pieces of legislation. Uh, we the the way that we decide what wins and what loses um, must at some point be rooted in some calculation of what measure or what candidate gets the majority of the votes. We certainly couldn't have, what gets the greater number of votes rather than what gets the lesser number of votes. But perhaps the traditional, majority voting system that we have, majority rule system, when it comes to a presidential or congressional election, the two, major federal, national types of elections that we have, we obviously don't elect Supreme Court justices. They're appointed. We indirectly elect them, right, by electing the people that appoint them. But regardless, the way that we determine procedurally, right, the tallying procedure that we use to determine what threshold is required, what threshold is required to determine the winner, whether that be a candidate or a piece of legislation, matters, right, in making outcomes fundamentally more democratic. And I would regard our democracy as a constrained democracy. And I would agree that systems of separations of powers and checks and balances are all, what we have is not a direct democracy or a pure democracy, but a constrained democracy. And I think that there perhaps, although I don't want to get into this in this video, there is perhaps a wisdom in the constrained democracy model. I think that's inarguable. But I'm not really going to touch or question or challenge or validate, negate or affirm the larger, more general structures at play here, only to say that we do have a constrained democracy, but ultimately the reason that democracy is regarded as valuable is because it's deliberative. It's a process by which we regard 2 heads as better than 1, 3 heads better than 2, 4 heads better than 3, 5 heads better than 4, right? I mean, it's a process of deliberative debate between competing interests and competing ideologies and competing philosophies and competing candidates and ways of thinking that ideally would then generate the optimal compromise that then serves us all better, right? And instead of just serving the interests of some, we can come up and generate a political compromise out of this mess that serves all. And ideally, that's what we would have. That's the whole point of democracy. When you have power, when you have limitless power vested in, certain discretionary actors, what inevitably happens is, to the extent that they're enlightened, their moves in the game, their judgments, and their plays in the policy and law game and governance game are good because they're enlightened. But ultimately, we regard power as a power. I wouldn't be opposed. I would not be opposed to the idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's more of a rule of thumb than a fact in every given situation. But that statement seems to work well enough across history, and so the whole point of democracy is that it's deliberative. That what arises out of the whole process of debate is some sort of optimal political compromise that serves the interests of the multitude rather than just the elites within that multitude. And so that's the point. To me, that's part of what democracy is and why it's valuable inherently as a mode of governance and administrating law and policy. It's not very hard to impose law and policy or even to create it. What's important is how we decide who gets to do that and how we limit those that have the power to do so in productively constraining ways. But in our constrained democracy, such as we have, does not negate the value. Just because our democracy is constrained doesn't mean that at the core of its ideals is democracy, is one of those ideals. So we definitely have to encourage a more deliberative process of policymaking, lawmaking, and governance by which different agents of power are constructively checked by other agents of power, so that in this whole process of deliberation between branches and between powers, we can generate policy, law, and governance that is an optimal compromise that then serves the multitude and all of its varying interests, if not equally, if not completely equally, which is impossible, better than they would be served if we simply had some sort of monarch that could be purchased by the rich and the powerful or whatever. I'm not going to get into the theory behind that. But the question I pose as the title of this video is, what about supermajority rule, right? I mean, the way that we decide, who wins and who loses, what given piece of legislation passes and what does not, is a process of tabulating votes and deciding on some system by which we tabulate the majority, what gets the majority of the votes. But we can more or less optimize the different ways in which we do that same thing. In regular, democratic elections, the congressional and the presidential elections, we have plurality voting systems. We just decide, what candidate gets the majority of the voters that turned out, the majority of the votes that were cast, as opposed to a majority system determining what candidate gets the majority of the votes from the total number of eligible voters, rather than just the voters that turned out. And that's fine. I don't see another system that we could use for our elections at that level. I don't see another system that we could use that would not require us to compel voters to turn out. Obviously, I regard voting as a kind of speech, and to compel voting is to compel speech, which is not free speech, meaning it violates the First Amendment. So I would regard the First Amendment as so that's all that I have to say about that at the moment. But we need to make the whole process of generating legislation, generating law and policy more deliberate, more deliberative, less political and more deliberative, less political and more objective, less political and more evidence concerned, less political, less ideological, and more compromising. And if we can do that, we can serve the interests of the multitude rather than serving the interests of the majority. We want to ultimately, policy and law, we want it to be some sort of compromise, a political compromise of, that takes into account the total interests of the multitude rather than just the interests of whatever majority rules at the time, which the founders regarded as the tyranny of the majority problem, which I've talked about in previous videos. So in what way, do we go about making the whole process of generating law, policy, and legislation more deliberative and more democratic, more conciliatory and compromising between competing interests? To the extent that we can do that, I mean, because we have to rely upon a majority, right? We have to rely upon some, whether it's a plurality system or a majority system, the way that we decide what passes and who wins has to rely upon some sort of majority voting system, a tabulation of who or what gets the majority of the votes of those that turn out, or of the total number of voters. And so, but how could we optimize the process of those tabulation processes, voting tabulation procedures, to make ultimate outcomes more democratic and more democratically deliberative in the way that the founders would have desired? And I think that what it comes down to is, so I've already talked about the fact that I asked the question, what about supermajority rule? We have minority rule, majority rule, and that naturally raises, going on to the next step, what about supermajority rule? And what about that option? And it's something worth considering. It's a question worth considering. I don't think that something like that could work at all at the level of congressional or presidential elections, because that would require, supermajority rule would require that we can't decide the winner until we have a supermajority turnout level, a level adequate for us to be able to say who gets or what gets the supermajority. And that would require us to increase turnout. That would require us incentivizing turnout is not going to generate the sufficient amount of turnout. Compelling it would be necessary. We can incentivize turnout in various ways, which I've talked about in previous videos, but we cannot compel turnout. We cannot compel voting. I would regard that as a violation of the freedom of speech because it amounts to compelled speech. But regardless, I think that the supermajority rule could certainly work, if not at the level of elections, deciding who gets to rule government. It could work at the level of deciding what pieces of legislation pass, what proposed laws and policies win. It could work at that level of the system. And I think it could most certainly work at that level of the system with relative ease. What I'm suggesting is essentially this. I believe that the current regime voting scheme in Congress to get pieces of legislation to pass through either one of the two houses that we have is you require a simple majority, right, of the total Congress, of the total number of representatives in each house. You require that simple majority level of votes to be able to decide what passes, what is validated, what piece of legislation is validated in each given house. Well, the problem with that is we decide what party each house belongs to based on a measurement of the what party would gain the simple majority based on how each of the representatives identify in any given vote. And so the element of parties is important here. Hopefully that was coherent. We decide what party controls based on what party controls either house, based on just simply based on the number with respect to the fact that a simple majority is required to get anything to pass. We judge which party has control of either house based on which party possesses the simple majority to pass things. And that's fine, but I don't think that a simple majority will really do. In a previous video, almost from the perspective of legislative efficiency and of making it easier to get things to pass through the houses, simple majority is better from the perspective of legislative efficiency because you don't need as high a number of representatives to vote for it to get something to pass. You just need the simple majority to get something to pass, either one of the two houses. Depending on where the pieces of legislation starts, it's passing the House, then the Senate, or the Senate, then the House, which is another interesting dynamic we could discuss in a later video. Perhaps we should reconfigure how we decide what passes both houses based on where legislation should start and end. Maybe we could think about that in a later video. There may be some logistical mystery there that then allows us, we could penetrate some logistical mystery there that then allows us to make normative prescriptions about what voting systems we should use and voting procedures we should use. But irrespective of that, we'll cover that in a later video. In this video, what I want to propose is, in order to pass something, right, in either one of the houses, to render the whole process of passing something more deliberative and more democratic, I would suggest that we require, rather than just simple majority rule, supermajority rule. If you require supermajority rule, from the perspective of efficiency, it is harder to get things passed But from the perspective of democracy and democratic outcomes, it actually ensures the legislation that passes through these houses then be passed on to the executive for final consideration, or at least more ultimate consideration. And then the judiciary afterward, if we pass through all of these various hurdles. Well, I think that supermajority rule at the level of deciding what passes Congress would actually be very beneficial. Because if you require, so then it's if it's a this is the implication. This is the logical implication that I'm trying to communicate here. If we require right now to pass a piece of legislation in either house, only a simple majority is required, right? We could make it so that a supermajority is required to pass anything. Whereas now, okay, so we decide what party controls the House based on what party has the simple majority, right? If we require a supermajority, right, to get anything to pass either of the houses, then it would naturally require to pass anything would require some support from the party in the minority, some support in terms of votes from the party in the minority. Right now, we basically just say that, the party that controls any one of the two houses is the party that has the simple majority, right? If we require to pass anything from either of the two houses, if we require instead a supermajority vote to decide what new legislative proposition passes, that would naturally require there to be bipartisan support. It would naturally require a requirement of a supermajority to pass anything through either house rather than a simple majority would encourage that pieces of legislation that do pass have bipartisan support that comes from a supermajority requirement rather than simply the requisite partisan support that comes from the simple majority requirement. Does that make sense? Yeah, hopefully that's coherent. I think that ultimately bipartisanship, a certain amount of bipartisanship is good. And I think that's ultimately what this proposal would encourage, is more bipartisanship. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. In sum, we don't need to get too much into the weeds here with regard to the element of bipartisanship, although that is a concept that I want to cover a little bit more deeply in a moment. But the simple logic is this. If to pass any given new legislative proposal, right, which we would, a bill, right, to use a simpler word or a simpler term, a one-word term rather than a two-word term. It would be advantageous, I think. It's the logic is that requiring just a simple majority to pass something through either house, that requires a lower number of total votes right? That requires a lower number of total approval votes. It requires a lower number of total yes votes. A supermajority requirement to pass anything requires a higher number of total yes votes. And I think the benefit of that is it naturally leads to, bill passages that are backed by more yes votes. And I think in order to make the whole process more deliberative and to make pieces of passing legislation as democratic outcomes more democratic, I think the more yes votes a piece of legislation has, the better. Even better when with this supermajority requirement, it's much greater than just the majority requirement, or at least somewhat greater. It's a somewhat heavier burden to meet than just the simple majority vote. The supermajority vote requirement to guarantee passage of any given piece of legislation or bill, it does require more yes votes. The more yes votes, the better, right? And the more bipartisan, right, the complexion is of the total pool of yes votes, the better. Because in that way, the more bipartisan, right, the more bipartisan support there is, the more cooperation there is between the two parties to generate the passage of a given piece of legislation, the better, the more democratic it becomes. If we assume that these two parties represent two different kinds of sets of interests, right? Democrats represent an entirely different set of demographic interests than Republicans do. But with the current system that we have, it's this, with the party system that we have, Republicans win, Democrats unrepresented. Democrats are not represented. Democrats win, Republicans are not represented. It's better, instead of this partisan divide that we have in this partisan scheme, it's actually much better that we have more bipartisan cooperation and bipartisan deliberation in generating new pieces of legislation, because that ultimately ensures that more varied interests are represented, that the interests of the multitude, rather than just the majority, are represented. And I think that was the dream that our founders had in designing the government, the legislative, executive, and judicial system that we have, which comprises the government that we have. That was their vision. And I was talking to a friend about this last night. That's why it was the case where when we were electing the president, it was the custom, rather, the legal custom, that the candidate that gets the runner-up candidate actually becomes the vice president, right? Rather than the president and vice president running on being elected together. They were actually elected separately, right? And the runner-up would become the vice president. It ensures that president is of one party, right? If parties arise, which they naturally do, and they're convenient for many reasons, which I could talk about later. If you have the president in one party, the vice president in another, naturally, if they're just one party, they're representing the party, and they're a little bit more unrestrained, unconstrained, and less deliberate. They're just representing that party's interests. But if you have the executive office split between two separate parties, you have more back and forth, even if the vice president doesn't have any power anyway. You have more back and forth between those two parties. And what that ultimately produces is more deliberation, which is the whole point of democracy, ideally. It's a deliberative process of exerting power and creating policy. That's what democracy is supposed to encourage, right? From a utility perspective, that's why it's valuable. It's not just valuable for the bland, sort of ethical reasons that we all posit for democracy, which is that, oh, everyone should be represented, and that's fine too. But really, it's that democracy generates deliberation between competing interests, which generates policy that is some sort of compromise between the competing interests that serves both simultaneously, because both simultaneously have to be represented under one government. We can't have multiple governments because that's multiple countries. We want one government, but naturally, with having one government, having to maintain one government, you have to represent varied interests under that one umbrella. So people confuse, it's not about enforcing, democracy is not about enforcing principles or majoritarian will. It's about deliberation between competing interests that ultimately generates a compromising policy or compromising kind of law, irrespective of the majoritarian will, right? There's a difference between those two things. The absolute rule of the majoritarian will is not democracy. So that's just an idea, and it's not meant to be any kind of revolutionary proposal. It's just to say that even if it can't work at the level of congressional and presidential people's elections, a supermajority requirement for a vote, requiring a supermajority to pass a bill in each of the either of the two houses, may actually be better, because it ensures that the bills that pass require more and more yes votes from a more and more bipartisan group of cooperating representatives, rather than the partisan shill bullshit and partisan. And this is the thing. This is the problem with partisanism, right? Is it's unstable. When you have a government like ours that becomes too partisan or goes too far in one ideological direction, represents two interests too singularly, and is ignoring of other competing interests, what inevitably happens is it becomes unstable. Democrats pass Obamacare, Republicans revoke it. Democrats pass gun control measures, Republicans revoke it. Republicans pass abortion restriction measures, Democrats revoke it. Democrats pass free speech free speech bills and laws and proposals, Republicans revoke it. So naturally, the more bipartisan this space becomes, the more unstable law becomes, the more changeable the whole thing becomes. Whereas if we could cooperate in a more deliberative bipartisan fashion and try to represent differing ideologies, philosophies, interests, classes, peoples, races, demographics, cooperatively into one singularity point of compromise, we can achieve more stable law, more stable policy, less ideological policy and law, right? If you're just legislating on the basis of your religious ideology or your political ideology, well, that's not good, because that's just usually ideology departs from substance, and so into the realm of belief rather than of facts. So it's just to say that we have to make these distinctions, and it's only to say that if we're asking the question, if I'm asking just general questions, what about majority rule? What about supermajority rule? I mean, that's the natural question that then arises. As I said, it can't work at the level of presidential or congressional people's elections, but it could work at the level of congressional voting, right, on bills, and on the level of any kind of legislative stage in the whole process of a bill becoming a law, which doesn't work in the other direction, a law becoming a bill. But we have to, or maybe that could work. Maybe there's some interesting insight there that should be noted. All right. So it's just to say that when it comes to congressional House voting on pieces of legislation, we should probably require, rather than a simple majority to pass, a supermajority to pass. This ensures that each piece of passed legislation has more yes votes from a more bipartisan group of voters, of representative voters. And I think that makes the whole process more deliberative and more balanced in terms of the interests that it represents. And that's much better than partisan policymaking or lawmaking or legislation writing and whatever. So more cooperative bipartisan dynamics in the production of legislation that would naturally arise from the need to get a supermajority to pass bills is better. And it's better because it slows the process down and it makes it more deliberative in many ways, and more balanced, makes pieces of legislation that pass more balanced in terms of the interests they represent, simply because in order to pass a piece of legislation in either house, you need this supermajority, right? More yes votes than would be required under the simple majority system we currently have. And the more yes votes that are required, essentially what this would do is it would force the parties, moving away from the simple majority requirement to pass bills in either house. Moving toward the supermajority requirement would then force the parties to work together, which is ultimately a good thing, a much better thing than the ideological rather than compromising system we currently have. Thank you for watching.